Before we begin, get comfortable. If you've been here before, you know what this is. If this is your first time, welcome. This channel exists for the moments when you want something to settle into. Something calm, something real. Something that takes you somewhere else without requiring anything from you. If this kind of slow, careful, historical storytelling is what you've been looking for, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. There's no pressure in it. And before we go anywhere, drop a comment and tell us where you heard about this video. A recommendation, a search at midnight, someone's playlist. We genuinely want to know how you found your way here. Now, settle in, turn down the lights if you can, and let's talk about a world that is much stranger, much richer, and much more human than anything they ever put in a textbook. When most people picture the Middle Ages, the image arrives fully assembled. Dirty streets, gray skies, a castle on a hill. Knights clanking across muddy fields, peasants bent over soil. The whole thing wrapped in a vague sense of gloom. As though the 1,000 years between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Renaissance were a kind of extended intermission in human progress. A dark waiting room that history had to sit through before something better arrived. That picture is wrong in almost every interesting detail. The real medieval world was stranger, noisier, more colorful, more complicated, and far more human than the simplified version taught in most schools. Tonight, we are going to explore 50 of its secrets, 50 things about ordinary medieval life that are almost never mentioned in the classroom. Some of them will surprise you. Some will make you smile. Some will make the past feel unexpectedly familiar. And by the end, the image of the Middle Ages you carry in your mind will, I hope, be a little more accurate and a little more alive. The first thing worth knowing is that medieval people had no idea they were living in the Middle Ages. The very phrase, Middle Ages, was invented by scholars of the Renaissance who were looking backward, deciding that the centuries before their own era had been a kind of pause. The people actually living in the 10th century, the 12th century, the 14th century, did not think of themselves as inhabitants of a dark or backward time. They thought they were living in the present. They had courts and scholarship and cathedrals and poetry and philosophy. They had laws and medicine and trade networks that stretched from England to China. They had pride in their craft, their city, their faith, their family. They did not experience their own era as darkness. They experienced it as life. Scholars of that time had a concept for the intellectual tradition they were part of. The idea that knowledge was a structure built by generations, each standing on the work of the ones before. The philosophers and theologians of the medieval world did not believe they were starting from nothing. They believed they were continuing something, and they were right, which brings us to sleep. Because one of the most genuinely surprising things about everyday life in the medieval world concerns something as ordinary as how people slept at night. They did not sleep the way we do. What we treat as normal, a single uninterrupted block of 7 or 8 hours, beginning somewhere around 10 or 11 at night and ending at the alarm, is actually a very modern invention. Before artificial lighting changed the rhythm of daily life, before gas lamps and then electric bulbs pushed the boundaries of the usable day, human sleep was structured differently. The historian Roger Ekirch, who spent 2 decades studying the nocturnal habits of pre-industrial people across Europe, found more than 500 references in historical documents to what people simply called the first sleep and the second sleep. 2 separate blocks of sleep, each roughly 4 hours long, with a period of wakefulness in between. This middle-of-the-night interval was called the watch, and people treated it as a natural and productive part of the night. They would stoke the fire, say prayers, check on animals, talk quietly with whoever else was awake, sometimes visit neighbors. One physician of the period even recommended the watch as the ideal time for a husband and wife to conceive a child, because the mind was calm and the body rested. The phrase first sleep appears so casually in medieval texts, in letters and diaries and ballads, that it clearly required no explanation. It was simply a term everyone understood. The way we might say dinner time or dawn. The idea of sleeping straight through the night in a single stretch without any break, would have seemed to a medieval person both unusual and probably unhealthy. And the night those people woke into was genuinely, completely dark. A darkness that most of us living in modern cities have never experienced and can barely imagine. There were no streetlights in the medieval world. No gas, no electricity, no glow at the edge of the sky from a town 10 miles away. On a moonless night in a medieval village, the darkness was absolute. A person stepping outside after nightfall could not see their hand in front of their face. The world beyond the firelight was simply black. This sounds simple, but it had profound consequences for how people organized their lives. Virtually everything important, travel, trade, construction, farming, happened in daylight. The night belonged to those with torches, to the bold and the criminal and the drunk, and to the animals that had no choice. Now here is something the textbooks almost always get wrong. Medieval people were not dirty. The idea that medieval Europeans never bathed, that they lived in a permanent state of filth and stench, is one of the most persistent and most inaccurate myths in popular history. Public bathhouses existed in nearly every medieval city of any size from the 12th century onward. In some towns, authorities actually fined residents who failed to visit a public bath at least once a week. The city of Nuremberg, which was one of the more hygiene-conscious municipalities in medieval Europe, maintained 14 separate public bathhouses. Medieval bathing was also a social occasion. People ate and drank in bathhouses, gossiped, played games, conducted business. The German bath etchings of the 15th century, which historians have studied carefully, show rows of bathing couples sharing tubs and eating meals naked together, in an atmosphere that looks far more like a restaurant than a medical facility. Soap, made from animal fat and wood ash, had been in common use in Northern Europe for centuries. It was often scented with herbs. Sage and thyme were popular. Wealthy people bathed in private tubs padded for comfort. Ordinary people used communal facilities or basins of heated water. The standard of cleanliness was not the same as today, and the infrastructure was nothing like modern plumbing. But the desire to be clean was entirely normal, and medieval people pursued it as best their circumstances allowed. Cities in the medieval world were also much smaller than most people imagine. When we use the word city in relation to the Middle Ages, we should not picture anything like a modern metropolitan area. Most medieval cities, places with walls, a market, a cathedral, a bishop, official recognition as urban centers, contained somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 people. Paris, in the 12th century, was probably home to around 50,000 people, which made it enormous by the standards of its time. London in 1300 had perhaps 80,000. Florence, at its peak before the Black Death, may have reached 100,000. These were exceptional cases. The vast majority of what were called cities in medieval Europe were communities that a person could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. And outside those small cities, most people lived in villages and small market towns, so local in their orientation that many people never traveled more than 20 miles from the place they were born. Not because they were imprisoned or forbidden, but because everything they needed was within that radius. And the world beyond it was for most practical purposes, not their concern. Within those cities and towns, the primary food was bread. This is not a metaphor or a simplification. Bread was the literal center of the medieval diet, consumed at every meal in quantities that would seem enormous to us. A laboring man in medieval Europe might eat 2 or 3 pounds of bread in a single day. Bread was made from whatever grain was available and affordable. Wheat for the wealthy, a mixture of rye, barley, and oats for the poor. The shape and quality of the bread a person ate signaled their position in the hierarchy as clearly as the clothes they wore. Fine white manchet bread for the noble household, coarse dark maslin bread for the laborer. Alongside bread, dried legumes, peas and beans provided the majority of protein for the poor. Meat was expensive and relatively rare outside the tables of the wealthy and the clergy. Fish was more common, especially on the many days the church required abstinence from meat. and supplementing it all, in quantities that would alarm a modern pediatrician, was ale. Beer was not a luxury in medieval Europe. It was a necessity. Water, especially in towns and cities where human and animal waste found its way into the water supply, was genuinely dangerous to drink. Ale, which had been brewed and was therefore relatively free of the pathogens that lurked in untreated water, was the safe alternative, not the strong, hopped beer we associate with the word today, but a thin, mildly fermented grain drink with relatively low alcohol content. Children drank it. Elderly people drank it. Monks drank it. The rule of Saint Benedict allocated each monk a daily allowance of roughly half a liter of wine, and in northern countries, where wine was unavailable, ale was substituted. The idea of giving a child a drink with alcohol in it seems alarming by modern standards. But in a world where the alternative was water that might give you dysentery, the pale and mild ale of a medieval household was genuinely the safer choice. What people would have paid almost anything for, and often did, were spices. The medieval spice trade was one of the great economic engines of the era, and the value placed on pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg by medieval Europeans was almost incomprehensible by modern standards. Black pepper, which today costs almost nothing and sits in a shaker on every kitchen table, was so valuable in medieval Europe that it was sometimes used as currency. Rents were paid in peppercorns, the phrase peppercorn rent, which we now use to mean a nominal or trivially small payment, originally referred to something genuinely costly. The Visigoth king Alaric, when he sacked Rome in the year 410, demanded as part of his ransom 3,000 pounds of peppercorns alongside silver and gold. A pound of ginger could buy a sheep. Cinnamon and nutmeg were consumed as status symbols at noble banquets, their presence on the table communicating wealth and global connection as clearly as any jewel. The reason these substances were so expensive was simple. They came from the other side of the world, traveled through dozens of middlemen across land and sea routes controlled by Arab and Italian merchants, and arrived in Northern Europe after a journey that might take years and involved genuine mortal risk. The spice trade drove exploration, funded empires, and started wars. It is not too much to say that the search for a direct route to the spice-producing regions of Asia was one of the primary forces that sent European sailors out into the Atlantic and around the coast of Africa, changing the map of the world forever. Medieval streets were loud in ways we rarely picture. The noise of a medieval market town was layered and constant. The cries of vendors advertising their wares, the complaints of animals being led to slaughter, the rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths and cobblers and coopers working in their open-fronted shops, the bells of the church marking the hours, the occasional horn or drum of a traveling entertainer. Medieval craftsmen organized themselves into guilds, which were professional associations that controlled training, quality, and pricing within their trade. The signs above their shops were often pictorial rather than written, because a significant portion of the population could not read. But everyone knew what a painted boot or a striped pole meant. Market days, which typically happened once or twice a week in most towns, transformed the central square into a chaos of temporary stalls, livestock, shouting, and commerce that served as the social hub of the entire surrounding region. And within those market towns, the houses themselves were far simpler than we often imagine. The typical home of a medieval craftsman or laboring family was not large. A single room that served as sleeping space, cooking space, storage, and workshop. The floor might be beaten earth, sometimes covered with a layer of straw or rushes that was swept out and replaced periodically. The walls were timber frame filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches packed with clay, dung, and straw. The roof was thatch. There was a hearth in the center of the room, or against one wall with a hole in the roof above it to let out the smoke, except that the smoke often didn't make it out, filling the lower levels of the room with a permanent haze that stained everything it touched. Windows were small openings covered with wooden shutters, or, in wealthier homes, with oiled cloth stretched across the frame. Glass windows existed, but they were expensive and rare. found in churches and the homes of the wealthy, not in the ordinary house of a craftsman or farmer. Fire was the constant background threat of this built environment. Medieval towns were dense concentrations of timber-framed, thatch-roofed, straw-floored buildings in which open flames were the only source of heat and light. A single spark landing in the wrong place could ignite an entire street. The great fires that swept periodically through medieval cities. London burned catastrophically in 1212 and again in 1666, though the later date falls outside our period, were not accidents or failures of caution. They were the almost inevitable consequence of the way cities were built and the way fire was used within them. Town authorities knew this and tried to regulate it, banning thatched roofs, requiring stone party walls between houses, appointing watchmen to patrol at night. But fire remained a permanent feature of the medieval urban landscape, and everyone who lived in a timber-framed town understood at some level that their entire world could be ash by morning. Animals were woven into the fabric of medieval domestic life in ways that feel unusual to modern sensibilities. In a peasant household, it was entirely normal for pigs, chickens, and even a cow or goat to share the living space during winter, both because the animals needed shelter from the cold and because their bodies added warmth to the interior. The line between inside and outside, between domestic space and barnyard, was far more permeable than anything we would recognize today. Rats were everywhere, in grain stores, in thatch, in the walls of buildings, in the holds of ships. This was not a situation that went unnoticed. Medieval people were well aware of rats as pests and nuisances. What they did not know was that the fleas carried by those rats were capable of transmitting the most catastrophic disease in medieval history. The Black Death arrived in Europe in October of 1347, when a fleet of 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina after sailing from the Black Sea. Most of the sailors aboard were dead. The ones still alive were dying, covered in black swellings the size of eggs in their armpits, and groins that oozed blood and pus, and left the skin dark with bruising. The port authorities of Messina ordered the ships out of harbor immediately, but it was already too late. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and carried by fleas that lived on rats, spread from that initial point of contact outward across the whole of Europe with a speed and lethality that had no precedent in recorded history. By 1348, it had reached France, Spain, and England. By 1350, it had traveled as far north as Scotland and Scandinavia. Historians estimate that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died in the initial outbreak between 1347 and 1353. A range of somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. In some of the worst affected cities, the proportion was higher. Florence lost perhaps half its population of 85,000 in a single year. Paris buried hundreds of people per day at its peak. In England, the most careful modern analysis of available records suggests the population fell from around 4.8 million in 1348 to 2.6 million by 1351, a decline of nearly half in 3 years. No one understood what was causing it. No one had any effective treatment. The only response available was flight, and flight simply carried the disease to new locations. The Black Death changed everything it touched. It changed the labor market. With so many workers dead, those who survived found their labor suddenly and unexpectedly valuable, giving peasants leverage they had never had before, and accelerating the collapse of the feudal obligations that had bound them to the land. It changed art, the images of death that appear in European painting and sculpture in the decades after the plague, the danse macabre with its grinning skeletons leading people of every rank in an equal procession toward the grave, reflect a culture that had been altered at a deep level by the experience of mass death. It changed the relationship between people and the church, which had promised divine protection and delivered none. And it changed medicine, though slowly and in complicated ways, pushing some physicians toward a more empirical observation of disease, and others toward increasingly desperate appeals to astrology and theology. But before we reach the plague, let's step back into the somewhat calmer territory of medieval power. Because here too, The popular image contains important misconceptions. Medieval kings had far less actual power than we tend to imagine. The image of the absolute monarch, the king whose word was law, who could command anything and have it done, belongs more to the 17th century than to the medieval period. In the medieval feudal system, a king's power was real but constrained in ways that were structural rather than merely political. The king sat at the top of a pyramid of obligations. Beneath him were the great lords, dukes, counts, earls, who held their lands in return for military service and the payment of certain dues. Beneath them were lesser lords, who in turn held their lands from the greater ones on similar terms. Each level of the hierarchy owed obligations upward, but also held rights downward. A king could not simply confiscate a great lord's lands without cause, could not levy unlimited taxation without agreement, could not declare war without consulting those whose men and resources would actually fight it. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215 by King John of England, under pressure from his barons, is the most famous example of this structural limitation on royal power. But the principle it embodied was not new. It was a formalization of something that had been true in practice for centuries. One consequence of this distributed power structure is that most medieval kings spent remarkably little time sitting in palaces. The majority of European monarchs before the 15th century had no fixed capital. Or rather, they had several places that functioned as administrative centers, and they moved between them constantly. A medieval king was, in many ways, a traveling administrator. He moved from royal manor to royal manor, from castle to monastery to city, consuming the resources of each location before moving on. His court, his family, his advisors, his household servants, his guards, his treasury moved with him. The roads of medieval England or France or the Holy Roman Empire were periodically animated by these royal progresses, which were at once political demonstrations, administrative tours, and logistical necessities. Collecting taxes in this world was its own enormous challenge. In a period before banks, before efficient communication, before centralized record-keeping of the modern kind, extracting money from a population scattered across hundreds of villages and manors was an exercise in constant negotiation and partial success. Tax collectors, appointed officials who traveled through regions gathering the dues owed to the crown, were universally unpopular figures, and the medieval literature that portrays them as corrupt and grasping was not entirely unfair. Much medieval taxation was indirect, collected in the form of goods rather than coin, and the opportunities for fraud at every level of the collection chain were considerable. Kings frequently went to war substantially in debt, funding campaigns through loans from Italian banking families, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Medici, whose financial network spanned the continent. Medieval justice, particularly in its earlier forms, operated on a set of premises entirely foreign to modern legal thinking. The most important of these was the idea that God was not a remote deity who had set the world in motion and then stepped back, but an active participant in human affairs who could be relied upon to signal his judgment through observable outcomes. This belief was the foundation of the trial by ordeal, which remained a legitimate judicial procedure in much of Europe well into the 13th century. In the ordeal by fire, an accused person was required to carry a piece of red-hot iron a specified distance. The hand was then bandaged. 3 days later, the wound was examined by a priest. If it was healing cleanly, the accused was declared innocent. If it was infected, they were guilty. In the ordeal by cold water, the accused was bound and dropped into a body of water. If they sank, they were innocent. The water, a sacred element, had accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty. In trial by combat, accuser and accused, or their appointed champions, fought until one was unable to continue. The loser was not merely defeated. They were judged by God to have been wrong. The Church finally withdrew its priests from these procedures at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and in England, at least, jury trials gradually replaced them. But the underlying logic, that justice had a divine dimension that could not be reduced to merely human evidence, remained influential long after the formal procedures that expressed it had been abandoned. Public executions were a standard feature of medieval civic life. The scaffold or the gibbet was not hidden away from public view. It was typically placed in a prominent location, the market square, the main road into town, the bridge. Execution was understood as a demonstration, a message delivered to the largest possible audience. The body of a criminal or a traitor might be left hanging for days or weeks as a continuing reminder. We tend to find this difficult to reconcile with other aspects of medieval culture, the cathedral architecture, the illuminated manuscripts, the philosophy. But these things existed in the same world because medieval people had a different understanding of the relationship between the body and the law, between punishment and order, between private sin and public consequence. Justice was not private. It was communal and theatrical and visible by design. The church was the single most powerful institution in the medieval world, more powerful in many respects than any individual king or emperor. It owned vast amounts of land throughout Europe. It ran the hospitals, the schools, the universities. It controlled access to marriage and inheritance through its monopoly on the recording of births and deaths. It had its own courts, with jurisdiction over a significant portion of the population. It collected taxes in the form of the tithe, and it held, over every person in medieval Europe, the most powerful leverage available: the threat of excommunication, which could cut a person off from the sacraments and, in the medieval understanding of salvation, from eternal life itself. Kings themselves were not immune to this power. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV famously stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa in 1077, waiting 3 days for Pope Gregory VII to lift his excommunication, because without that lifting, his political position was untenable. The church was not separate from medieval politics. It was one of its primary actors. Life expectancy at birth in the medieval period was very low, typically estimated at around 30 to 35 years across the general population. But this number requires careful interpretation because it is pulled dramatically downward by the extraordinarily high rate of infant and child mortality. Perhaps 1 child in 3 did not survive to their first birthday. Another significant portion died before the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition during hard winters, accidents, and the complications of childbirth all claimed enormous numbers of the very young. But a person who survived childhood and reached adulthood without serious misfortune could reasonably expect to live into their 50s or 60s, and some lived longer. The 35-year figure is an average across a population that included enormous numbers of people who died as infants, dragging the mean down to a level that does not represent the actual experience of adults who had survived their vulnerable early years. Medieval medicine operated from a theoretical framework inherited from the ancient Greeks and formalized by the Roman physician Galen. The body was understood as a system of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health. Illness was an imbalance, and treatment was directed at restoring equilibrium. This framework produced a medical practice that was partly effective, partly neutral, and partly actively harmful. Herbal remedies, many of which had genuine pharmacological activity: willow bark for pain and fever, garlic for infection, chamomile for inflammation, were used alongside bloodletting and purging, which weakened patients without addressing their underlying conditions. Surgery was practiced. Wounds were cleaned and stitched. Limbs were amputated. Cataracts were removed. But without anesthesia and without any understanding of infection. Every surgical procedure was a gamble in which the patient's survival depended as much on their own immune system as on the skill of the practitioner. Infection was the great killer, the silent consequence of every wound and every operation, not understood as a mechanism until centuries later. Medieval soldiers feared disease more than they feared the enemy. This is not a figure of speech, but a documented statistical reality. The camps of medieval armies were breeding grounds for the diseases that killed more soldiers than any battle: dysentery, transmitted through contaminated food and water, almost inevitable in the conditions of a campaign, could incapacitate or kill entire armies. Typhus, spread by the lice that infested camp populations with no access to sanitation, was another major killer. The English army at the Siege of Harfleur in 1415, before the Battle of Agincourt, lost perhaps a third of its strength to dysentery before a single significant engagement. This was not unusual. Medieval commanders understood it. They knew that holding an army in the field too long was to watch it dissolve from disease, but understanding it did not give them the means to prevent it. Knights, who formed the romantic center of the medieval military imagination, were in fact a small and expensive minority of any medieval army. A fully equipped knight, plate armor, a destrier warhorse, weapons, a squire, a spare horse, the financial resources to sustain a campaign, represented an investment equivalent to many years' income for an ordinary person. The complete armor of an English knight in 1374 was valued at over 16 pounds, at a time when a skilled laborer might earn around 2 pounds per year. A good warhorse alone could cost 40 or 50 pounds, the equivalent of decades of laboring wages. As a result, most medieval armies were not primarily composed of knights at all. They were composed of infantry, foot soldiers armed with spears, pikes, axes, bows, or crossbows, who made up the numerical majority of every force in the field. The English longbowmen who destroyed the French cavalry at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415 were not knights. They were yeomen, freemen, ordinary men trained from boyhood in a specific skill that gave them lethal effectiveness on the battlefield at a fraction of the cost of mounted cavalry. The armor that knights wore was not the clumsy, immobilizing prison that popular culture sometimes suggests. Modern tests of surviving medieval plate armor, conducted by historians and martial artists who have studied medieval fighting manuals, consistently show that a fit, trained person wearing full plate could run, roll, climb, mount a horse unaided, and perform a wide range of athletic movements without significant difficulty. The armor was heavy. Certainly, a full harness of plate could weigh around 15 to 25 kilograms, but that weight was distributed across the entire body by a system of straps and padding, unlike holding an equivalent weight in the hands or on the back. The crane myth? The image of knights being hoisted into their saddles by mechanical devices because they were too encumbered to mount independently is simply false, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which houses one of the world's great collections of arms and armor, has addressed this misconception explicitly. Battles, when they actually happened, were often remarkably short. The decisive engagements of medieval warfare tended not to be the hours-long attritional grinding matches of later warfare. The Battle of Hastings in 1066, one of the most consequential battles in English history, lasted perhaps 9 hours, but many medieval engagements were decided in minutes. The initial clash of mounted cavalry with infantry lines, the sudden collapse of a flank, the turning point at which one side's will to continue broke. These things happened quickly. What took long was the approach to battle, the negotiations, the maneuvering for position, the sieges that preceded most of the genuinely decisive moments in medieval warfare. Open field battle was actually quite rare. Most medieval military activity consisted of raiding, skirmishing, harrying the enemy's territory to destroy crops and livestock, and, most importantly, besieging castles and fortified towns. Operations that could drag on for months, and were decided as much by the management of food supplies and disease as by any direct military confrontation. The prisoner of war in medieval Europe was, under certain conditions, a valuable commodity rather than simply an inconvenience. This applied primarily to prisoners of high social rank, knights and nobles, whose families had the resources to pay for their release. Ransoming was a standard institution, governed by its own rules and practices, in which captured knights were held in relatively comfortable circumstances by their captors, and their families were invited to negotiate a price for their return. The ransom of King John II of France, captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, was set at 3 million gold acres. a sum that exceeded the entire annual income of the French kingdom. John, too, actually returned voluntarily to English captivity when the French failed to pay, because he had given his word as a knight to return if the terms were not met. Medieval honor, in this sense, was not an abstraction. It had real consequences, binding the behavior of even kings. Gossip moved through the medieval world faster than most people realize. The image of a static, isolated, medieval society in which information traveled slowly and communication was difficult is accurate for some things and quite wrong for others. Merchants were the great information carriers of the medieval world. Their networks of trade connected towns and regions and countries in ways that also transmitted news, rumor, and political intelligence. A significant piece of news, a royal death, a military victory, a natural disaster, a papal decision, could travel from one major European city to another in a matter of days, carried along the merchant routes by word of mouth. Travelers and pilgrims were also important vectors. The great pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Canterbury, functioned as information highways along which people from many different places exchanged what they knew. The medieval world was not the isolated, static thing we sometimes imagine. It was connected, and those connections transmitted information as well as goods. Winter was the hardest season, and not merely because of the cold. The entire agricultural system of medieval Europe was organized around the management of food from one harvest to the next, and the margin between enough and too little was narrow. A bad harvest, caused by drought, flooding, late frost, or simple misfortune, could reduce a community to genuine hunger within a year and to starvation within 2. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, which preceded the Black Death by a generation, killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population of Northern Europe, over 7 years of catastrophically bad harvests and brutal winters. Livestock died. Seed grain was eaten in desperation. People ate things, grass, tree bark, leather, that were not food in any meaningful sense. Communities that would face the Black Death within a generation had been severely weakened by this earlier catastrophe, their populations already reduced, and their agricultural systems not yet fully recovered. And yet, through famine and plague and fire and the grinding anxiety of lives lived close to the edge of what was survivable, ordinary medieval people found ways to laugh, to celebrate, to fall in love and get married, to raise children and watch them grow, to feel pride in their work and pleasure in the things they made. The medieval world had festivals, dozens of them throughout the year. The feast days of saints, the seasonal celebrations that marked the agricultural calendar, Carnival, and Easter and Christmas in the harvest home. It had music, played on instruments that would be recognizable to us, harps and lutes and flutes and drums. It had games, chess, backgammon, dice, ball games played in village squares. It had humor, preserved in the fabliaux and bawdy tales that circulated alongside the devotional literature in the same culture. The image of the medieval world as uniformly grim, as a place where joy was impossible or forbidden, is simply not supported by the evidence. Medieval people celebrated their lives with the same desire for pleasure and connection that drives human behavior in every era, constrained by their circumstances rather than their nature. There were superstitions everywhere in the medieval world, woven through daily life as thoroughly as religion and practical knowledge. People wore amulets against illness and bad luck. They consulted the stars for favorable days to plant crops, or begin journeys, or agree to contracts. They left offerings at the boundaries of fields to appease forces they did not understand. They interpreted dreams as messages and signs. They believed in the evil eye, in witches, in spirits that inhabited particular places, in the efficacy of specific herbs and words and gestures for protection against harm. We tend to look at this from outside and classify it as ignorance, as the residue of paganism not yet fully displaced by Christian theology. But medieval people themselves did not experience it that way. They lived in a world where the causes of most of the things that happened to them, disease, weather, crop failure, the death of children, were genuinely mysterious, and they populated that mystery with explanations that gave them some sense of agency and meaning. The superstitions were not failures of reason. They were attempts at reason in a world where reason had limited tools available to it. Travel was genuinely dangerous in the medieval period, in ways that are easy to underestimate. The roads of medieval Europe were unpaved tracks that became impassable in wet weather, without signage, without reliable maps, and patrolled only sporadically. Outlaws and bandits were a real presence rather than a literary device. They existed because the law was thin in the spaces between settled communities, and because poverty pushed desperate people toward desperation. A merchant traveling between towns with valuable goods did so, knowing that the journey itself was a risk, and that the company of other travelers offered safety in numbers that solitary travel could not. This is part of why medieval inns developed along major routes, not merely as commercial hospitality, but as nodes of safety where travelers could rest behind walls. The great pilgrimage routes were somewhat safer than ordinary roads, because they were more heavily traveled and more closely watched. But even pilgrimage was not without its dangers. The church's calendar organized time in ways that reached into every corner of medieval life. The year was not simply a sequence of months, but a structured sacred narrative, moving from Advent through Christmas and Epiphany, through Lent and Holy Week and Easter, through the long ordinary time of summer and autumn, punctuated by dozens of saints' days, each of which was in theory a rest from labor and an occasion for worship. In practice, saints' days were also occasions for fairs, games, and celebrations that blended religious observance with popular festivity in ways that made church authorities periodically uncomfortable. The calendar also governed what could and could not be eaten. The hundreds of days per year that were designated as fast days, on which meat was forbidden, had enormous consequences for the food trade, the fishing industry, and the agricultural economy. The castles that we associate with medieval power and prestige were not, in fact, comfortable places to live. This is worth dwelling on, because the castle looms so large in the romantic imagination of the Middle Ages, battlements, great halls, knights and ladies, that we tend to forget the physical reality of the buildings themselves. Castles were built primarily for defense, and the qualities that made them defensible made them uncomfortable to inhabit. The walls were thick stone, which absorbed cold and held it. The windows in early castles were tiny, because large windows were structural and defensive weaknesses, which meant that rooms were perpetually dark even in daylight. Fireplaces, which we take for granted as the basic heat source of any medieval interior, were not even common features of castle design until the middle of the medieval period. Before their introduction, heat came from a single open hearth in the center of the Great Hall, around which everyone gathered, and the smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof, or simply didn't, hanging in a layer above the heads of the hall's inhabitants for hours at a time. The Great Hall itself, the central communal space of any castle where the lord ate, administered, entertained, and was seen by his household, was a place of considerable ceremony, but also considerable noise, smell, and disorder. The floors were covered in rushes, dried grass or reeds, sometimes mixed with herbs to manage the odor, that absorbed spills and dropped food and the droppings of the dogs that moved freely through the space. The rushes were swept and replaced periodically, but between changes, they accumulated everything that fell or was dropped or walked in, and the lower layers could be genuinely unpleasant. The historian Francis Geese, writing about castle life, describes the floors as flea and rat infested, with the smells of the kitchen, the stable, and the castle toilets mingling in the shared air. Medieval accounts confirm that large gatherings in the Great Hall generated a smell that we would find overwhelming. The castle toilet, the garderobe, deserves particular mention because it is simultaneously one of the more practical and more startling features of medieval castle architecture. Garderobes were small chambers built into the walls or towers of castles, typically projecting outward over the exterior wall or over a pit. Waste fell directly down through a shaft and landed either at the base of the wall, in a moat, or in a cesspit that was periodically emptied by workers called, with cheerful directness. Gong farmers. The name garderobe, which literally means to guard or store one's robe, comes from the fact that clothing was often stored in or near these chambers, because the fumes from the waste below were believed to kill moths. Castles that survived from the medieval period often still have their garderobes intact. Small stone chambers projecting from the outer wall with a simple stone seat and a hole. They functioned in the most essential sense, but they were drafty, cold, exposed to the elements through the open shaft below, and not particularly private. For ordinary people without access to a castle's garderobe, peasants, most townspeople, the options were more basic still. Chamber pots emptied into middens or into the street, or outdoor privies above pits. The smell of a medieval city was real and significant, though it varied considerably by location, season, and the particular activity happening nearby. The absence of municipal waste management of any modern kind meant that organic refuse, kitchen scraps, animal dung, the contents of chamber pots, accumulated in streets and gutters, and was eventually either washed away by rain, dried and blown away, or simply remained until someone dealt with it. In towns situated near rivers, much of this waste found its way into the water. Medieval authorities were not unaware of the problem and made periodic efforts to address it. Many towns had regulations requiring residents to clean the street in front of their properties, and some had designated areas outside the walls where particularly noxious trades like tanning and slaughtering were required to operate. But the gap between regulation and practice was significant, and the daily sensory reality of a medieval town center on a warm summer day would have been, by modern standards, extreme. Within this context, letters were genuinely rare objects. Most people could not write. Literacy in the medieval period was not universally absent. Scholars, clergy, many merchants, some members of the nobility, and an increasing number of urban professionals could read and write, but it was far from common among the general population, and for a significant majority of people, written communication was simply not a practical tool. News traveled by word of mouth. Instructions were conveyed verbally by trusted messengers. Legal documents were read aloud to the parties involved by a scribe or a priest. The idea that a medieval peasant would sit down to write a letter is, for most of our period, simply anachronistic. This means that information moved differently, filtered through speech and memory and the reliability of individual messengers, accumulated errors and elaborations as it passed from person to person, and arrived at its destination as something between news and rumor. It built the great cathedrals, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, Salisbury, structures of such structural sophistication and aesthetic ambition that they still draw millions of visitors and still prompt genuine awe in people who approach them knowing exactly how they were built. It produced the universities of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, institutions that have been in continuous operation for 900 years. It developed the foundations of common law and constitutional governance that eventually became the political frameworks of the modern world. It created illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary beauty, works of art made one page at a time with materials of tremendous expense and skill. It developed techniques of navigation, of agriculture, of metalworking, of textile production that were genuine innovations rather than mere continuations of ancient practice. The medieval world was not a pause. It was a place where an enormous amount of human intelligence and creativity and effort was continuously being applied to the problems of existence, with results that are still visible in the world we live in today. The people who lived in it, the peasant woman grinding grain before dawn, the merchant calculating the profit on a bale of pepper, the stonemason high on a cathedral scaffold guiding a stone into place, the child running through a market square, the monk copying by candlelight, the knight cleaning rust from his armor after a morning's exercise, were not figures in a pageant. They were people. They worried about their children and their harvests and whether the winter would be mild. They told stories. They made music. They argued with their neighbors and forgave their friends. They loved particular places and particular people and particular foods. They had moments of unexpected joy and long stretches of ordinary tedium. They faced things that should have broken them, and sometimes did, and sometimes didn't. Behind the castles and the legends and the dates and the battles, there were millions of quiet human lives. Ordinary, complicated, irreducible, exactly as human as ours. And that, perhaps, is the most important secret the Middle Ages has to tell. If this kind of quiet, unhurried historical storytelling is how you prefer to end your day, this channel was made for you. Consider subscribing. There is a great deal more of this to come. And if this video found you at the right moment, a like means more than you might expect. Sleep well.